Richie, one of the topics that we hear about the most, understandably, is people want to know how much they really need to practice. How long does it take to see the benefits of meditation and these other practices and ideas that we talk about all the time? And one thing that we both talk about in response to that is this idea that making a real difference in your own mind and actually practicing these skills, whether it's related to connection or awareness or insight or purpose, whatever it might be, is actually much, much easier than most people think. There's this idea in the Tibetan tradition of practicing for short, brief moments many times throughout your day. And we often talk about micro practices or micro dosing well-being, micro supports. We have all these all these jargony terms we use, but I thought we could just talk about that a little bit. I can share maybe some of the meditative view on that in a few minutes, but maybe we can just start off with just any opening thoughts you have about this. This has become a huge topic for us in terms of our research and thinking as scientists. So why is this even important to you? Why have you latched onto this as such a key idea?
Yeah, it's a really, I think, important topic. And uh, in my own experience, both as a practitioner and as a scientist, there's been an evolution over time. When we first began, both as a practitioner and as a scientist, there was a sense of really sort of putting in your hours on the cushion and the image I have is taking an unruly mind and wrestling with it, sort of jumping on it and fighting with it and uh, uh, um, pacifying it in some
Yeah,
way.
actually, that's a very common term you find in meditative literature, is like you are taming your mind, like it's just this wild beast that needs to be subdued.
Yeah, yeah, and the more hours you can put in, the better you'll get at taming your mind. And like a fight, it requires you to be bruised in the process. And so, um, pain was something that was a kind of necessary accompaniment you know, if that happened. So, those were kind of the way that we were thinking about it early on. And we've talked about it before in Dharma Lab too, a little bit, but just to remind viewers, in the very first paper that we published, that was a randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based stress reduction, a form of awareness training that's been popularized by John Kabat-Zinn. This study was published in 2003, and it was the first randomized controlled trial of MBSR that had ever been published. And we searched, and I can tell you, we were very motivated to find a relationship between the number of minutes or hours you practiced and changes that we were seeing, changes in both psychological symptoms of, for example, anxiety and depression, but also changes in biology, changes in the brain, changes in the immune system. And to make a long story short, we looked at it in every possible way. We found nothing. There was no relationship between how much people practiced and these outcomes. And we have reason to believe that people were quite honest with us in reporting their practice, because there are some people that reported that they actually had zero practice. They did go to class each week. They went to the MBSR class, but although they were instructed to practice in those days for 45 minutes a day for a minimum of 6 days a week, they reported 0 minutes of practice for the entire 8 weeks of the program. And their changes turned out to be comparable to the changes that other people that we saw in other people who reported a lot of practice. So this was the first clue that this was going to be complicated.
Yeah, I've got a great story that perfectly echoes what you just said. So with one of my dear friends and one of your dear friends, Edwin Kelly, I taught a meditation class in the healthcare system in Minneapolis. This is probably 15 years ago. we were at a local hospital, and we were teaching the caregivers. It was nurses, mainly, I think mainly nurses, some doctors, but basically caregivers in the healthcare system there. And we were teaching them, about these practices. And there was one story that I'll never forget. There was, at every session, we would do kind of this check-in, and people would just share how their practice was going, what was coming up. And there was one woman who sheepishly raised her hand in week 3 or 4. It was like halfway into the series. And she said, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I haven't actually done any practice yet. Like, I haven't done any formal practice. And you could tell she was embarrassed even to admit that to the group, because other people, of course, had been sharing what had been happening in their formal practice. And you could tell she was embarrassed. But then she suddenly got very animated. She said, but I had this experience I've got to share with everybody. And she talked about how she lived it was kind of multi-generational. She was a grandmother, and her grandkids lived with her. So she lived with her daughter and her daughter's husband and their kids. And she talked about how her granddaughter would just be like tearing around the house like a furious demon, like early in the morning, and it would just grate on her nerves. She liked to sit quietly with a cup of coffee and enjoy the morning, and they're just yelling and screaming and whatnot. And she talked about how suddenly in the middle of one morning, she found herself having her normal reaction where she'd get frustrated, and then she'd kind of snap at her granddaughter, and suddenly she had this moment where it's almost like she woke up and she shifted, where she just listened to the sound itself, noticed her reaction without getting caught up in it, and just let it come and go. And she just shared that. It was the simplest thing, but it was exactly what you said. She hadn't done any meditation. This was just a shift in perspective from coming to the classes. And it goes to another topic we've discussed, where practice is more than just what you do in any formal practice. That can help, and it's certainly important, but it's not the only part. The shift in perspective, what we call the view, is important. Applying it in daily life, as this grandmother did, that's important. So anyways, it just goes to show that this isn't the only way up the mountain, so to speak. It's one part that can help a lot, but it's not the only way.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And, we often talk about doing short times many times. And these short times can be very informal. They don't have to be formal practice. They can be done with one's grandchild screaming, um, or they can be done while taking out the garbage and just reflecting on, you know, helping your family by doing this regular kind of chore. Uh, and so these little moments, when they accumulate over time, can really add up to something quite substantial.
So if you think about it from a brain point of view, anything we experience is going to be reflected in the brain, right? Like, you're going to have all this symphony of brain activity that changes based on whatever it is we're experiencing, both our subjective experience and the environment we're in, all of these different things. So is one way to think about this is we're kind of like inducing flashes of like brain states, like you're trying to bring online a particular configuration of brain activity at any point in time. Is that one way to think about it? But you're just doing it intentionally, whereas normally it's just kind of passively happening.
I think that's one way to think about it. A related way of thinking about it is when we engage in these everyday activities, and if we take the example that you gave, Court, of this nurse or healthcare provider who was listening to her granddaughter, and initially she may have been reacting to it, and then just listening to the sound. Um, what that often is reflected in is a change in how different networks in the brain are connected to one another,
Hmm.
the interconnectivity among those networks. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an overall change in activation in a particular network. It often is the case that these early changes are changes in how these networks are connected. So, for example, in the case of the healthcare provider who might have been initially getting irritated in response to her granddaughter. The irritation is the sound comes in and it's just immediately triggering parts of the salience network, which is a network that responds to emotional events. And one of the components of the salience network is the amygdala. And so listening to the sound of her granddaughter was kind of immediately triggering the amygdala. Uh, and what might occur is as she is putting into practice some of the skills that she was learning in the meditation class you were teaching with Edwin, she was listening to the sound, and there was less connection to the salience network. It was just listening to the sound without it hijacking the rest of the brain, so to speak, by activating the salience network. And so that would be reflected in a change in connectivity between the parts of the brain that are processing the sensory information and the parts of the brain that are reacting emotionally to this information.
So even right now, as you were saying that, I was tinkering with my own inner states and just noticing to do exactly what she had done. And the way she reported it was she said she just listened to sound and she saw that this is just sound. Like, I don't have to have this strong reaction to it. It's just sound. And so as I was listening to you and anybody listening right now, you can almost choose to attune yourself intentionally and consciously to what you're listening to. And the interesting thing is, it may be the case that you were listening before. Like when I was listening to you and you were talking about this, I was not distracted. I wasn't thinking about something else. But when I consciously chose to put more of my attention on the sound of your voice, it suddenly became a more rich, dynamic experience. It was almost like I was just channeling more of my mental energy into the experience, and so it just became a richer, fuller experience. And then similarly, I kind of shifted back to my body, like what's my inner reaction going on? And then it's almost, again, I'm still listening to you, still taking what was going on in the moment. I wasn't distracted from that, but now I'm just checking, like, am I reacting to this anyway? What is the reaction? And I imagine that that's also, you're kind of shifting the brain networks that are coming on and offline at that time are shifting as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is really cool about the way you describe that is that this is another thing that I think we've mentioned in an earlier episode of Dharma Lab. The aperture of awareness may be shifting. And so in this case, the aperture of awareness may be expanding. So you're no less attentive to the voice, but you are aware of a broader range of phenomena that are happening in the moment. And that expansion of the aperture really helps to change one's reactivity to the specific content of what may be unfolding.
It's such a helpful skill to have. When I was learning to meditate for the first time in the early 1990s, I was, for part of that time, actually, I was waiting tables in a sushi restaurant, as I was working my way through college. And I noticed at that time, because I was paying attention to my mind, I was also learning to meditate. I was probably just more conscious of this than I would have been had I learned this before I was meditating. But I really noticed the importance of the aperture of awareness. And in particular, waiting tables, I saw that you need to have a very panoramic awareness if you're waiting tables. Like if you're like really laser focused, you're going to be like the worst waiter ever. And this was definitely not my calling in life. I was actually a terrible waiter, but at least I was able to realize how I could almost expand the field of awareness. So as I'm just walking from, say, the front of the restaurant back to the kitchen, you need to kind of have your whole, you need to have a field perception. Like you need to know, like table 7, is just finishing their dinner, and table 3, like just got there. And are they still holding their menus, or have they put them down and they're ready to order? You kind of have to be really opened up. And if you're just in your mind, or if you're just focused onto one thing in front of you, you're just going to miss all of that. And consequently, people are going to be upset at you, which I experienced many times in my ineptitude as a waiter. But actually, it was really helpful for me in that experience because I started seeing that that's a skill, that in some cases you actually want to have a narrow awareness. In some cases, you want and need to have a very panoramic awareness. And being able to actually flow with that and to respond to your environment in a conscious, intentional way versus in a more reactive, habitual way actually is a skill and a really helpful one that is not only helpful when you're waiting tables, it's equally helpful when you're with a friend who needs your attention and maybe is having a rough day, or you're at work and you're just trying to stay focused. It's all these configurations of your inner mental states that you can just get good at, you know, attuning to what's needed in the moment. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that would be, I think we would love to hear from all of you who are listening to this episode about ways in which you might play with the um, control of the aperture of your awareness. You can explore the intentional expansion or contraction of the aperture again in a way that is context appropriate. Sometimes you need to be really focused, as you were saying, Court. Other times it really helps to be expansive. And it also reminds me of some star athletes, for example, basketball players or hockey players. There was a famous article in the New Yorker many, many years ago, which I love to cite, that profiles the lives of three very different people. But one of them was Wayne Gretzky, the famous hockey player. And one of the things he talks about is having a panoramic view of the hockey rink. He just knew where everyone was, where the puck was, and had this uncanny ability to see the whole environment. And he said that that gave him this superpower to be able to be the kind of great player that he was.
So is the kind of going back to this idea of short moments scattered throughout your day, or short moments many times, or micro practices. It's not as though it's not likely that anybody is just going to have uninterrupted attentiveness to their own mental states, right? We do get lost, we get caught up in things, but you can just have these little glimpses, these little flashes where you're just tuning in to where your mind is at. Is your mind contracted? Is it expansive? One of the things that you often say, Richie, that I think is so helpful, and something that you can just practice noticing, is how certain emotional states contract awareness. If you pay attention, you'll notice, like that grandma, in a moment of frustration or anger or annoyance or fear or anxiety, you can go down the list, you almost feel a contractedness. You can feel your attentional focus narrow. You can feel a sense of tightness physically. You can feel all of this contraction on many levels. And what the noticing gives you the opportunity to do, as this grandma experience, is you can open it up. You can, just noticing that suddenly puts you back in the driver's seat. So I don't know, maybe you could just share a little thoughts on that, because you say that all the time, and I always find it helpful because it's just so true. You can just feel that rigidity and tightness when we're afraid or we're angry.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of science that is behind this that shows that indeed fear or anxiety literally does constrict the aperture of awareness. People are only aware of what is in their central focus. When a person is afraid, he is really focused on looking at their environment for the presence of threats, and that really contracts awareness. And so, one of the invitations is that when we do get lost in the way you described, and we all get lost some of the time, when we recognize that we've been lost, those are important moments that we can harness as moments of practice. That are these short times, many times kinds of opportunities that we can harness in our everyday life. And so rather than getting down on ourselves for getting lost, we can be thankful that, wow, this is a reminder. I can do a little bit of practice in this moment, and do this short time, many time kind of thing. Each time I get lost and then recognize it. And this is something that can help in multiple ways. And again, is very accessible.
Yeah, I found that too. And actually, I experienced this many, many times in my early years as a meditator, where I would just kind of get down on myself when I noticed that I was not following whatever game plan I had set up for myself, when I wasn't as mindful as I wanted to be, or I wasn't as kind and caring as I wanted to be. But actually, what you're saying is more that we should celebrate that we've noticed what's going on, rather than beat ourselves up for whatever might have been happening. Of course, we're going to fall into old habits. That's part of just working with the mind. But we don't often give ourselves credit for the fact that we're noticing that stuff. There's this great analogy in the Buddhist tradition that's coming from ancient India and monsoon season. And Mingyur Rinpoche, who you and I have both spent a lot of time and learned a tremendous amount from as as far as meditation goes, he oftentimes talks about this example of a river in monsoon season where you have all of this sediment, and basically the river is just kind of muddy and cloudy. And if you go and you look at the river, you just see this kind of muddy water, and you don't really see much in the river. And if you go back 6 months later, when the weather is calmer and there's not so much sediment, suddenly you'll see all these fish, you'll see all these plants, all sorts of things in the river that you didn't see before. And it might feel like, wow, where did all this stuff come from? And of course, all that stuff was there all the time. It was there in the monsoon season too. It just, you couldn't see it, right? Because the water was too muddied. And that's kind of how the mind is. Before you pay attention, you are probably totally oblivious to all the times where you get lost in thoughts, or the mind has these reactions where they just take over before you've even noticed what's happening. And this is showing that just paying attention to that is not, even though it might be painful coming face to face with your own mind, actually that's something to celebrate. That's the beginning of completely relearning how to be with your own mind and emotions. And it's an amazing thing. Even though it's humbling, it's an amazing occurrence, actually.
Right. And there's opportunity for that every day, many times a day. And that's a way that we can harness these experiences of everyday life.
Yeah. So that's just a little bit on this idea of short moments, many times. Maybe the take home here, if somebody were to ask you, well, how much do you really need to practice to benefit from this? And how much time do you need to take out of your day to set aside? And maybe the take home would be actually no time. You literally can do this, as Richie just said, simply by shifting your perspective in the midst of whatever you're doing. Short moments scattered throughout your day. And even if that's the only thing you did, that would be utterly and completely transformative to your inner world. Of course, sitting meditation and formal practice is profoundly helpful as part of that, but just those short moments really, really do make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. And please tell us about your experiences in this way. We'd love to hear.
Yeah, yeah. I would love to hear what your own practice is, how you bring these ideas and principles into your own life. So maybe we can have a little chat in the Dharma Lab discussion. So please share with us. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon for another episode of Dharma Lab.